Hello, Will. Welcome to another episode of Immlight. This is a special episode. So tell us something about the season. What happened?
Yeah. Well, technically season one is over, but the Canadian federal election 44 is in a week today, but when this video is released, probably in a few days, September 20th. And we saw a couple other podcasts, some other discussion, but we were like, you know what, we need to do one. We owe it to our viewers. We know we have a lot of newcomer viewers, first-time voters, and immigration and Indigenous issues, especially, have sort of fallen off the forefront. So we wanted to talk about them.
There's always subset issues that we need to tease out from all these wonderful podcasts. So we thought it would be a wonderful opportunity to bring in three wonderful guests today to actually talk about those issues. But first of all, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I am in the traditional territories of the Muwekma Wamwuk and Yokuts of the San Joaquin Valley.
And I am on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Kaiklat nations here in Burnaby, British Columbia.
And as Will mentioned, immigration issues have largely been overlooked during this election cycle, election 44. And the talking heads, essentially on TV, have focused, and rightly so, on key issues that are preoccupying a lot of Canadians' minds, such as COVID relief, building back better, as they say, and essentially just recovery from all the things that have happened in the year and a half.
Absolutely. But all these things are also interrelated. So, whether it be climate change or it be COVID, there are a lot of these issues that intersect directly with immigration. For example, climate change is going to create a new generation of individuals seeking to come to Canada because of the climate issues that their home countries. For example, COVID has led to delays that have really separated a lot of families. And we hear from one of those individuals today on our show as well. So I think it's really important that we talk about the two issues of Indigenous issues and immigration issues, because they have been the most overlooked at a time when there's been huge impacts felt by Canadians on both issues.
The next issue that we'd like to talk about would be, essentially going through the sponsorship process, the family class applications, and the processing delays and the hurdles that a lot of folks would have to go through in order to get their loved ones to Canada in the time of COVID, when a lot of these concerns were highlighted and actually aggravated and made worse. I think that conversation needs to happen. And what about our third guest, Andrew? Let's talk about him.
Yeah, so after Brooks and Cassandra, our third guest today is Andrew Griffith. And Andrew is a policy advisor, a writer, a blogger. He was the former director general of IRCC. So an individual with just so much wealth of knowledge, done a lot of research. We're going to share some of his information with everyone so it can help inform your vote. And he's going to present the different party platforms. And I think, Steve Murians were coming after your podcast, but, we wanted to do our version as well of, and I love Chantel. So that was an incredible episode. We're doing our own version as well with Andrew Griffiths.
And without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first guest. And Brooks Arcand-Paul is a litigator based out of Edmonton, whose practice includes Aboriginal employment, corporate, commercial law, with particular expertise in First Nation matters. His experience with treaties gives him a strong foundation and appreciation for comprehensive negotiations and agreements. And he has appeared before the Alberta Court of Queen's Bench and the Provincial Court of Alberta. He's a dear friend of mine from law school. We've been friends for years now, and it is my pleasure to welcome him to our show. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Brooks. Why don't you go and give our viewers a little bit of an intro about yourself?
Tante nitikason sipsis kapotagawin na unia kamas nakitik nigutuasik. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Greetings from wherever you are. My name is Brooks Arcand-Paul. I am currently in-house legal counsel to the Alexander First Nation. I have diverse legal experience in litigation, employment law, corporate commercial law here on the prairies in Alberta. And I got my start actually with the Attorney General of Ontario. My home territories, I'm on them right now, is Amiskwaciwâskahikan, which is Edmonton, Alberta, in Treaty 6 territory. I come from the Alexander First Nation. I'm Nehio Napio. From my traditional name for our nation is Kipotaga, which means the land of the Bushton people, where there's lots of trees around where we're from. And so it's very, very location specific. I've been practicing for, I think, I'm in my fifth year, going on to my sixth year. And I have a wealth of experience, I think, in Indigenous law and primarily Aboriginal law as it relates to the Canadian state. And I have a very vested interest in your podcast and in immigration law as it relates to the further history of Canada moving forward. Naskamon for having me this morning.
Thank you, Brooks. And first off, I'd really like to thank you for sharing your time with us and to give us your thoughts on some of the issues that are on the front burner during this election season. So why don't I just jump into it? So first of all, I'd like to get your thoughts on what should first-time voters or newcomers who may not have the vote but are influencing their spouses who do have the ability to vote and their friends as well about, let's say, Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous issues. What would you like them to use as their frame of reference?
Yeah, for those that might have seen in the news over the past couple of months, and I know this podcast has touched on it, the histories of residential schools are coming to light again. I know that for a lot of people, whether you're new to Canada in the last year or new to Canada in the past couple of years, we should be alive to the this understanding of what residential schools are. And if certainly not, if you haven't been here for very long or have not been paying attention to Canadian news for a long time, most recently, there have been over 6,000 unmarked graves found at the sites of former residential schools here in Canada. What that means, and this isn't all brand new to us, we've known about these graves, whether it's through our conversation with elders or in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report itself. We've known that there's about 43,000 unmarked graves still yet to be found. So we're only at that very small tip of where we're at. But that doesn't just deal with these unmarked graves. That also goes to this understanding of intergenerational trauma and where Indigenous folks are at when it comes to looking at this election and the type of issues that Indigenous folks are being faced with right now. We're looking at the platforms of the parties and the conversations that they are having. I think the first time I've ever heard any Indigenous anything with respect to the election was at the federal leaders debate the English language federal leaders debate this past Thursday. I was not impressed by any of the I guess positions that the leaders have put forward. I think with the exception of Miss Paul, who was able to identify that Indigenous sovereignty should come first. I think for your listeners and for those that do tune in, being of the understanding that we are sovereign people, that we are on our own homelands and are displaced from being able to make any decisions with respect to how we relate to the land, which is very foreign from how we used to do this hundreds of years ago. I think that over the terms of Canada's existence, we haven't had that same relationship that we had perhaps 300 or 400 years ago, where we were able to dictate the laws and how we related to the land and how the land was being utilized, or even just how we related to each other. So our traditional principles of Wakotowin and our traditional principles of relating to each other, which that's what that term means. It's one of our sacred laws and one that I hold very dearly to my heart. We don't have that ability to relate to each other. And I really respected Anne-Paul's comments of respecting Indigenous sovereignty. And to an extent, Yves-François Blanchet also mentioned it, but with more emphasis on nationalism from a Quebec standpoint. So when we're looking at how these leaders are not talking about Indigenous issues, it really is quite concerning in light of the fact that these 6,000 graves have been found over the past couple of months. I don't know what the impetus is to not have this conversation. I think a lot of people are more concerned about the COVID response and the economic recovery, which rightfully understandable. But we also have all of these issues that still exist in the absence of those conversations, and we need to have these conversations. I know for me, my understanding right now with where the federal parties are at with respect to immigration is very scant because they're not having those conversations either. We're talking about Afghans, which is very important. We should be having that conversation. We should be bringing in more Afghanis from what's going on in overseas, but at the same time, we're not talking much about any other groups of individuals that might need that kind of support here in Canada. So in tandem, what we're seeing, and certainly with really far right fledgling groups like the PPC and the Maverick Party to an extent, we're having these very antagonistic conversations about immigration, about Indigenous issues, but you're also seeing a lot of like a lot of our groups that are joining them in hand, which is very, very concerning because if you look at the roots of those parties, they're not, they don't have our best interests at heart. They have certain other underpinnings that they're interested in. And I think that that answers that question.
So, Brooks, thank you so much for framing this for us. When it comes to immigration, and I know I mentioned at the intro that you're interested in looking at the intersection between Indigenous and immigration issues. How do you think the relations between Indigenous and immigrant communities under this new government can be renewed or grown upon? What are your hopes for it?
Well, we only need to look back at Canada's history to understand that immigration and recent immigrants and Indigenous folks have always had very mutually intertwined histories. Whether you're looking at the first immigrants to this country, which are the Europeans, and then the subsequent progeny of both of our relationships, the Métis, we haven't had a very complicated relationship. Well, it is a very complicated relationship. I shouldn't undercount that. But in present day Canada, it's no different. I think that we have the same kind of responsibilities. And I know that for the longest time, one of my really dear friends, and actually LJ and I have had this conversation, but the understanding and the history of Indigenous folks with Canada has always been something that was never really talked about. We never really knew what that meant and what our responsibilities were to each other. But we certainly do have responsibilities to each other. It's within our treaties. It's within, and for those that might not know what a treaty is, they cover a vast expanse of what Canada is. And you have your historic or numbered treaties, and then you also have your modern day land claims agreements, which we have in British Columbia, the North, and in some in Quebec. We've always had that understanding on how we're supposed to move forward. I think from a very young age of Canada, we've understood what our relationship has been. I think we've kind of lost that. I think for new immigrants and new Canadians, that conversation isn't there because they're not being taught it. They're not being informed on what that relationship is. I know that there has been that change to legislation to reference the past that Canadians have and new Canadians have with Indigenous folks. But I don't think people know what that means. And certainly it is an ongoing relationship. It's an ongoing conversation that we need to have. But I think we as Canadians and Indigenous folks, we need to get to understand what that means for us and how we move forward in a good way. So what I see our way of moving forward is by having that mutual respect, understanding and learning from our communities. I know there's diverse, beautiful communities. I should say beautiful, diverse migrant communities here in Edmonton, Muskogee, and that cultural bridging that exists is quite beautiful, and I see it on the regular. I just wish that we had more of a commitment from our leadership on moving this forward, on moving this agenda forward. I find a lot of times with politicking, there's a lot of wedging communities against each other or leveraging communities against each other. And I think that that is a little bit concerning. And I don't want to say that raising Indigenous issues at the ire of or at the expense of another community is beneficial. I think there is room for all of us at the table to have these conversations and to make sure that our communities are mutually interlinked and moving forward in a good way, like treaties intended.
Wow, that's quite a lot to actually process there, right there. Thanks for sharing that, Brooks. Actually, to that point, it allows me to bring myself to the next question on communication as one of the tangible steps that we can do to actually basically bridge that gap between immigration and Indigenous issues. Now, I'm wondering, apart from communication, and I know that you have a lot of involvement in your community in Edmonton, and as we all know, Edmonton has a rich immigration history as well. I'm wondering, what tangible steps do you recommend be made to improve things, between Indigenous immigrant relations and with immigration writ large?
And I think that's a broader question for our communities as a whole. I think it has to happen from the grassroots level. It can't really be one that's dictated from the top down. But that's not to say that our leaders do not have a responsibility to help equitably fund our our interconnectedness. So at the grassroots level, we have an obligation to reach out to our neighbors and have those conversations and open and expand our connections. And that's not going to happen unless you have that conversation, unless you open your heart up and have those frank and honest spaces where you can share freely and share your experiences, because our experiences aren't that different. We may have come from different parts of the world, but we all have very similar commonalities that we should be open to and receptive and sharing with each other. So that communication is key. And I don't think it's going to be coming from our governments. It's not going to be a facilitated conversation. It has to be by ourselves, by us doing it together and true partnership. How you go about that? Well, you need to be able to have those funds available, whether it's through SSHRC funding grants, Heritage Canada grants, things of that nature, or even at the local level, at the provincial or municipal level. We need to have these spaces to gather and to have these conversations. And for Indigenous folks, we always welcome our neighbors, whether you're new to Canada or you've been here, your families have been here for centuries. You have a place at our table. We are more than welcome to have these conversations, and we always welcome anyone into our ceremonies, into our conversations, because that's the kind of people that we are. We believe in trust and reciprocity, despite the misgivings of the Canadian government over the past 100 or so years. We still are very welcome to our neighbors, and that is a core tenet of Wokotowin, of our laws, where we relate to each other and how we relate to each other. We have to make sure that we have these spaces available and have these dialogues, because my understanding and the way I believe our responsibilities are to each other is that we just have to listen to each other. So then that way we can set a chart forward that includes everyone, and it doesn't exclude anyone that rightfully deserves to be at the table.
Brooks, I wanted to ask about one thing, and I know you, and I really appreciate that point that the government shouldn't. It's up to our communities to facilitate this conversation. The government's role can only be so much, but in what the government has done, for example, for the Indigenous name reclamation that they were going to offer, they didn't speak to communities, and now they're finding out after the fact that their consultations had a huge oversight, didn't take into account specific character letters for name changes. For example, the municipal immigration programs, they haven't talked to Indigenous communities to the extent that I think they need to when there are ideas of bringing in newcomers to Indigenous lands or working with different nations. What do you think can be done there? Is there any room for the government to step up?
I love this question. I immediately, I got goosebumps thinking about like how this can be reformed, and that is a perfect opportunity to expand that relationship that was supposed to be developed under treaty. We were supposed to share this land together, and we're still intended to share this land together for time forever, basically, as long as the sun shines, as long as the grass grows and the rivers flow. We have an obligation to work together on these types of topics where we understand that Indigenous folks have had these laws and these processes in place for millennia, and immigration is not any different. Where we have that conversation, I think we need to understand that First Nations and other Indigenous communities have some catching up to do. We've been underfunded for both education internally for our folks, so we don't have sometimes the capacity to enter into those conversations, but it certainly is a necessary thing. There is case law out there that talks about how, actually most recently, well, my organization, the Indigenous Bar Association, I'm the vice president. I probably should have put that in my introduction, but we just did an intervener status case for Disautel at the Supreme Court of Canada, and that one deals with transboundary rights, and it's in essence an immigration issue, an immigration question. And we had never been part of that conversation. We've never been part of that conversation. And it is one that I don't think Canada thinks that we need to be a part of, but it is certainly one that affects our resources, our lands, just basic tenets of existing. And we don't get invited in any of those conversations because Canada doesn't deem Indigenous nations as worthy. And in those instances that they might do, it might be those specific nations that have transboundary interests, like the Haudenosaunee in Ontario, or some nations that are closer to the border between the United States and Canada. It's certainly there is a place for that kind of conversation, but I'm not sure if Indigenous nations are at that place yet to have those conversations about other immigrants that might be coming to Canada, because I certainly wouldn't want them to stop any of those conversations or stop individuals, like say from Afghanistan, to come to Canada and to live and prosper here just as much as we do. Because at the end of the day, there's still a lot of discrimination that happens with Indigenous folks, and that's by new Canadians, that's by old, I hate this term, but I'm going to use a Stephen Harperism. I think that for us, we need to understand that not everyone has the same capacity to have these conversations, and perhaps maybe we need to rethink how we include Indigenous nations in these conversations, because they have to be, immigration is just one part of where Indigenous people have to be at the table helping to make these decisions, because we remember our history, the Canadian history. Indigenous peoples helped with Confederation, whether we acknowledge it or not. There would be no Canada if there were no, if the Indigenous folks that were here did not help recent or new immigrants to Canada, help them exist here, whether that's through being hardy, making it through the harsh winters, through the difficult summers, or whether it is like present day today, where you have a really strong, vibrant history of Indigenous people always having really strong relationships with those individuals, that those groups that might have been facing the same kind of adversity as we were. So here in the prairies, we have examples of that with the Ukrainian population that exploded on the prairies in the late 1800s. I think that is something, 1800s, 1900s, early 1900s. It's around that time period, but we have always had those really strong relationships. Actually, one of my cousins is half Ukrainian, half Nehiao. And that just goes to show that we've always had really strong relationships with our migrant communities. And it is always a very, I think, because I think the reason why we have these, and this is just me, I guess, anecdotally speaking to this and not basing it on empirical data, but I think because they face such adversity when they come to Canada, whether that's through the systemic racism or this power politics that existed in Canada for the longest time between certain ruling groups versus others, we always had that kind of relationship with them because we were always at the lowest rung of society, and it still exists today. I'm sure. Yeah, I think that's, yeah.
Thanks for sharing that, Brooks, actually. And, as I guess, like, just to wrap up, I'm curious about any final thoughts and what really gives you hope, I suppose, at this historic junction with we're at a critical juncture. There's a confluence of a lot of issues coming to the fore, whether it be immigration, whether it be in Indigenous relations between newcomers, or even with, as you said, for previous and first waves of immigrants in Canada. Any final thoughts and hope from you?
I hope that we come together. Our communities do have a lot of similarities and connections. And one of my favorite things that I like talking about is the cultural aspect of things. I was actually just up in Whitehorse, and I was talking with a first generation Filipina, and her experience, she's actually in Whitehorse and the Yukon generally, they have really strong intercultural connections. And a lot of that comes from the progress that the Yukon First Nations have made in that territory. A lot of that cultural connection that has existed and that has flourished there has led her to understand that there are so many similarities culturally with her community and with the Indigenous community there. And one of the examples that I really took a lot of adoration from, and a lot of strength from, was when she mentioned a lot of the little folklore type things that exists in her community. And in her, she actually grew up in Manila half of the year, so she is very connected with her community. But a lot of the folklore that exists there and here in Canada, specifically in Yukon and even on the prairies, because I was sharing some of mine with her, it was really nice to see that there was just it was the exact same. There was the exact same, and I can't really speak about it because it's cultural stuff, but it was very heartwarming that those commonalities that we have wouldn't have been shared, or I wouldn't have had that knowledge had we not had these conversations, had we not brokered that relationship. And I think once we understand that as a nation, as a nation of folks that have all come here, and as Chief Justice Lamar said in Delgamuukw, that we're all, let's let us face it, we're all here to stay. I think we have a responsibility to understand each other and to get to know each other, and there's great strength in that. I think with the upswell of white supremacy and on top of that, systemic racism and ongoing genocide against my peoples, I think we have a responsibility as BIPOC to have these conversations and to work together and to group together, because we have a lot of very common interests and goals, which is equality for all and inclusion for everyone. Because we've lived so long being on the margins and not having these conversations, and feeling as if we're very powerless. But there's a lot of power in all of us together. And I think that if we want to understand multiculturalism as not just a concept, but an actual practice, we have an obligation to work on that, to break these walls down and build bridges and connect with each other. So in that way we can build a Canada for our children and our children's children that is equitable, that focuses on climate justice, that works in correlation with each other on our differences, that make us all the more stronger.
Thank you so much, Brooks. 谢谢. I know I'm going to be taking your words to the ballot box when I vote on the 20th. And thank you for taking your time this morning and sharing your wisdom with our listeners. We really, really appreciate you.
Naskamon, thank you for having me, and I'm sending you all good wishes and hopeful for a positive result in the election this year.
Thank you, Brooks.